Hey everyone, thanks for joining. Today I'm speaking with Christopher Rufo. Christopher is a journalist at the City Journal, and he's also at the Center for Wealth and Poverty um, at the Discover Institute, I think. Sorry, Christopher, I got that all mixed up.
That's it.
Um, Anyways, thank you for coming on. I was been following your stuff when you started putting out some of the stuff on um, like the CRT-based diversity trainings in the government, and now you're moving on to schools. Like I've been following that kind of stuff for a couple of years now and seeing it going, spreading further and further. And you're like one of the first real people who's been going out and actually showing what this stuff is in practice. I know like James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose and others have written about it in academia, but you've actually been showing what's going on in practice. So how did you get into that, and when did you start that?
Yeah, I started last summer, and honestly, it really came about at first by accident. I had someone email me and said that they were going through these horrific trainings on internalized white supremacy at the city of Seattle, and that I really should look into it. And just out of curiosity, I filed a public records request. Forgot about it. A couple months later, kind of received this trove of documents and then published a story on it, thinking that this would be a kind of interesting story about kind of hyper progressive government in Seattle. And this single story just exploded and traveled everywhere, was covered by a lot of different publications. And then all of a sudden I start getting, dozens and dozens of emails every day from other people around the country saying that actually these same kind of programs are in my institution. And then I really focused in on federal government agencies. And that was the focus of my reporting for the first few months.
Okay, I've read a lot of critical race theory, and like I said, I saw some of this coming into schools, but like, in the federal government or even in Seattle, I mean, it's a city government, but they're separating people by race. And doesn't anyone in the government just stop for a second and think, well, maybe that's not right?
Yeah, it's really shocking. And in Seattle, for example, I broke a story with an image, a set of images rather, of King County Public Library training sessions. They had one room with a poster that said for whites only, essentially, and then another poster for people of color. And it was, to me, visually reminiscent of the old segregation days when you had white and black water fountains in public parks. And it was just so shocking to see. I grew up was born in the 1980s. So segregation was long gone, and something that we only really looked at in history books. And to see something that just visually kind of had the exact same quality and characteristics, different intentions, but the same visual expression, I just found horrifying and shocking. And just it bewilders me that nobody in these institutions that employ, in some cases, thousands of people said, actually, wait a minute, are we deliberately segregating people in separate physical spaces just because of their race? Isn't this actually wrong? And unfortunately, in a lot of these institutions, nobody is willing to step up and dissent.
Yeah. Like that's what I don't get is, I mean, obviously someone's sending you something because, you weren't just like going out fishing or whatever, right? Like you said someone sent you an email. So there are people who are concerned about it, but again, I've been following this for a while, and it's just the only dog I have in any fight pretty much is free expression. But when like that kind of chill is going on in government departments now, in schools, with teachers and with students, where someone's afraid to speak out against something that's like so obviously wrong. Like, were you able to speak to anyone like these, like either the government organizations or the schools, where they would give you an explanation for why?
Yeah, I mean, in most cases, they actually explain the rationale explicitly in the documentation that they create. And the idea for the segregated spaces is that these are necessary in order for for two reasons. One is you have to prioritize, people of color and the experience of people of color, and segregation is justified because if you're to talk about, if you're to try to help white people come to terms with their white privilege and white fragility and internalized white supremacy, to do so in front of people of color would require too much emotional labor and potentially trigger too much trauma on behalf of the people of color, that it's not right to include them in the same room while they're deconstructing white identities. The other side is that it's also, they say it's not people of color's job to help white people with their racism. So the idea that white people should have the obligation not to impose upon people of color, but to actually confront their own racism on their own without demanding the time, energy, resources, or emotions of others. So those are the two main justifications. Again, I don't agree with either of those. I think they're crazy, but I try to say, that's what they're saying. That's the best case that they make.
Yeah. Again, it's like, I don't get how, I understand critical race theory in colleges. I mean, they teach a lot of stuff. Like, when I went to university, there were a lot of courses that were just out there. And it's like, hey, what are you wasting your time with this for? But like, take away the Robin DiAngelo and the Ibram Kendi stuff, I can understand the legal standpoint of critical race theory and, the frustration of things not moving fast enough for, people like Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw. And I can understand that frustration. I'm still trying to wrap my head around people thinking that this is a good practice. Like, this is a good way to solve racial issues in practice. Like, haven't we tried all this stuff before?
Yeah, I mean, the history of a lot of these ideas is pretty interesting. And I think that in some ways, it's really a kind of a historical process in which you had two competing strains of kind of civil rights movement ideologies or ways of thinking. You had the very broadly, the Martin Luther King kind of faction and direction and philosophy, and then the Malcolm X faction, direction and philosophy. You also had people on that kind of more aggressive, more militant side. You had, the Black Panther movement. You had Angela Davis and the Communist Party, and then assorted, very violent militant groups. And in the 1960s, Martin Luther King's vision and political movement won. They kind of soundly defeated the more kind of activist and more militant kind of factions, and those ideas were really kind of relegated to history. Those ideas had decisively lost by really the early to mid 1970s. And then all of a sudden, fast forward 50 years now, they're all being revived as if there's something new. And they're all really just kind of reheated and in many cases corporatized versions of the old kind of Black liberation movement in the 1960s and 70s. But the strange thing now is that instead of the kind of twist now is that instead of true revolutionaries, I mean, people forget that, Angela Davis is like speaking on college campuses now and included in all the podcasts or whatever. But at the time, she was truly a radical revolutionary. But now the radical revolutionary ideology has been absorbed by establishment academics, by diversity trainers, by school districts, and by, McDonald's. So now we have this strange world where McDonald's is trying to, kind of absorb kind of Black radicalism from 1971 and then make it into a corporate message. And I think that it's such a really weird and bizarre and kind of fascinating intellectual world that we find ourselves in.
Well, okay. Fascinating, yes. I don't know about intellectual. When Coca-Cola tells people to be less white, that's kind of weird.
Yeah.
But okay. All right. My family moved to Canada in the 70s. So I was 6 years old in 75 when we moved here. So I saw Canada change from like the mid 70s through the 80s. And it wasn't a lot of overt racism here. I experienced some, but not a lot. But it was only around the late 80s when that PC craze started going strong. And it was from well-meaning, you know, suburban liberals, like basically WASPs, right? Like the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. It's just,
Mhm.
and it was well-meaning, like I called it benevolent bigotry because it wasn't, they weren't really being bigoted, but it was just the stuff. It was like so much focus on race, and then it died down again. Then again, the late 90s, early 2000s, you start seeing it up again. I know like someone like Zach Goldberg was following it, but I don't know if you paid attention in the States to like the rise of like a rise of reporting on racism and linking that to an actual rise in racism. Like I'm not trying to blame one on the other. Um, but especially like in schools now, like I've noticed that this went back to 2010 in high schools, in some high schools in some parts of the States. But when you're getting a majority white population to focus on their race, like why are people scratching their heads wondering why white supremacy is going up?
Yeah, well, I guess you have to really you have to look at it in two. You have to separate out the kind of narrative from the reality. In some cases they overlap, and in some cases they don't. And I think you've seen from those charts that Zach Goldberg has this explosive increase in narrative surrounding systemic racism and white privilege and white supremacy. But I don't know. Is there a strong body of evidence that suggests that there's more racism today than there was in 2000 or that there was in 1980? Um, Again, I think there's a lot of ways you could look at that. You could look at that kind of factually or empirically, but I think that it's really hard to argue what the critical race theorists argue, that racism essentially is unchanged in the last century. They basically say racism is as bad now as it was in 1950. It's just become more subtle and more insidious and more kind of invisible, but it still has the same form. It's still upholding the same power structure. And I just, I don't know. I have a really hard time believing that. I don't think it's matches with most people's historical experience. And, you know, certainly in the work I've done as a reporter, as a documentary filmmaker in many parts of the country, in the United States and many parts of the world, I feel like it is at odds with most people's basic experience and perception of the world around them.
Yeah, okay, like the whole critical race theory thing. Like again, when Bell started writing, when he shifted from the critical legal stuff to the critical race theory in like the early 70s, like I think around like 73 or something like that. Um, I can understand where he was coming from, and okay, it's not moving fast enough. Um, I could get it, but to say that now, like to say that even in the late 90s, to say that okay, it's not as good as it was, it's the same in the late 90s as it was in 1890. Like there's no comparison. And I don't know if it was just an easy sell or if it was, like why you would want to buy into something so depressing. But when you mention the narrative, like this is just something I've looked at, and I think that like this started right after 9/11, and I'm not saying that there wasn't a spin before. There's always been spin, but spin was kind of based in facts as opposed to like, you know, using the spin to shape the facts. It was like the facts were shaping whatever your spin was. Um, but it was after 9/11 that the narrative thing really took off. Like I can almost see it where they made patriotism a racist thing, and then that carried on. I mean, things like the Tea Party didn't help, but you went from that to like, okay, Islamophobia, United States racist. If you're patriot, you're racist, and then go on through the Obama years. So like I've just seen this build up. Like I've followed it in relation to Islam, just because where I worked, and also because of my background and stuff. And when I came back in 2014, like all the crazy stuff being said, like I got called a white supremacist for criticizing Islam and things like that. And like that's when I started looking into it. So I don't know. I think this narrative, like the work Zach Goldberg's done, is good, but I think the narrative started like right after 9/11. I think it got out of academia in the late 90s, and it slowly started creeping into other places. Like I mean, that would be an interesting thing to kind of look at to see how, like, when this stuff started changing, like when that change made like happened.
I think, I can give at least shed some light based on my investigative reporting. And it seems like a lot of the groundwork was laid in the most progressive cities in 2010, kind of circa 2010. So a little more than 10 years ago. And you see a lot of these departments of equity or diversity and inclusion really kind of standing up at that time in these kind of more kind of vanguard areas, you could call them. And then there was this kind of explosion around 2014, 2015. And I think a lot of it emerges from just, if you look at the kind of timing and sequence, but this is before Trump. It started a number of years before Trump, 2013, 2014. And I think part of it was a bit of a kind of the excitement of the Obama era. You remember 2008, people were like moved. People were truly touched. People felt like this was such a great symbol of progress, of transcending racial divisions. And the kind of the halo effect of that started to wear off, and people started to feel, okay, that wasn't the kind of magic solution that some people were hoping it was going to be. And actually there are these problems. And I think it turned into a bit of pessimism. And if you look at, critical race theory, it's an explicitly pessimistic philosophy. And I think that pessimism, that kind of cultural pessimism that many people may have felt on the left, then could latch into that ideology, because that ideology gave them a rationalization for that pessimism. It gave them a reason to say, well, see, Obama is a symbol, but actually was a neoliberal president who maintained the structures of oppression. There's a famous, kind of the most famous Black Lives Matter activist in Seattle, actually called Barack Obama. I think something like a white supremacist in blackface. I mean, really vicious, like vituperative stuff. But I think it shows that the far left was really, by that time, disappointed, disillusioned, and that quickly turned into what I think is the driving emotion behind a lot of this stuff, which is rage.
Yeah, I mean, it's manufactured though. Like, because I'd like to get into what's going on in the schools, but I mean, you were training people to be outraged. Like, I mean, if you look at the people who teach some of this stuff, like the critical race theory, even the gender theory or the queer theory, like any of the critical social justice stuff, they're explicitly saying they're, activist scholars. They're putting activism before scholarship. So, I mean, you're manufacturing outrage. You're teaching people to look, whatever. It just happened within the last couple of months in Canada. So like a national real estate association said realtors shouldn't use the term master bedroom anymore. Use primary bedroom. And you're going looking for stuff to be pissed off at. So I mean,
Yeah. I think the Washington Post yesterday or a couple of days ago had, these bird names are legacies of white supremacy. It's like, all right, you're mad about some obscure bird names. Like, I think though, I wonder too though, Obed, I think like, it's like, is this really a sign of progress? Is this like the kind of 800-pound gorilla or the elephant in the room, right? Where we have made, in reality, in kind of those basic human political terms, we've made so much progress that we now have the luxury of being mad about bird names or square dancing or, the terminology for bedrooms and real estate listings. I think that is what I hope. I mean, I hope that that's true. And I think that that is true in a lot of ways, where we're so obsessed with symbols and that we lose sight of the fact that in reality, many things are much better than they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago.
Yeah, but I mean, like, that's, again, this is like, we're in a narrative fight now. I mean, you can throw graphs in people's faces all you want. I mean, like, there's been a few articles out recently about, okay, well, look how well, South Asians are doing. Look how well Nigerians are doing. I think whites are number 17 on median income. So there's 17 other racial categories or nationalities, whatever you call them, that do better than white people in the United States. So that's a really weird white supremacist system. But like again, we're in a narrative war. I think there's got to be stuff that like people like Chloe Valdery are trying. I think could be kind of interesting. There's also someone up here in Canada, Ishard Munji. She's got a new. She's working on a new like diversity training program and something that's more empowering instead of like this pessimistic stuff. Because I mean, people are being told. I see it up here in Canada. We had 4 senators yesterday, or was it yesterday or 2 days ago, on a Zoom conference, talking about how Canada is a supremely racist country. I'm like, no, it's not.
It's like,
No.
I don't know, where were you born, Obaid?
I was born in India.
Okay.
In
India. Okay.
Yeah.
Then you would probably have traveled widely, as have I, and it's like you would be very surprised to go to my father immigrated from Europe, from Italy, and everywhere I've gone around the world, in Asia, in South Asia, in Europe, in the Middle East, you see like really, in some cases, in some countries, really brutal racism and racial conflict. And there's this perception of the United States that is at odds with the perception that we have of ourselves now. And I think it's just it really is kind of a sad thing. And I don't know as much about Canada. Obviously, I'm an American, but Americans have always thought about Canada as like kind of left-wing Americans rather have always thought about Canada as an enlightened version of the United States. And then so it's funny for us now to hear that even Canada, the left in Canada, is now engaging in this self-criticism.
It's okay. Like, we're so close. Trudeau Senior, so Pierre Trudeau, he'd said that living this close to the United States is like sleeping in bed with an elephant. Every time it moves, you wake up. And I mean, we get everything from you guys. Canadian television, has had a few good things, but it's mainly we get American television, American movies, American everything. So as soon as the George Floyd incident happened, our prime minister talked about police killing people and like massacres by police and, police going crazy. And then you look at the stats from 2000 to 2017, there were 450 killings by the police. So less than half of what you guys get in a year we had in 17 years. And our prime minister is talking about police going wild in Canada.
And then divide that by the number that were unarmed, and then divide that by the number that were not, threatening or engaging in, trying to run someone over the car. Yeah, it's a minuscule number. And I think that the narrative is really important. And I think, as I've really thought about it, is we're such a saturated culture in media and symbols and now social media that our kind of abstract ideas and ideologies and beliefs are so disconnected from our real physical experience that you have essentially a dueling narratives. You have a kind of right-wing narrative, a left-wing narrative. They engage with each other. They battle with each other. They kind of take territory, cede territory. And to me, it's fascinating. I'm part of that discourse, part of that debate, part of that discussion. But I do find myself oftentimes feeling like that's kind of like my online life, my very engaged kind of narrative, abstract life. And then I actually look at my real life and my family and my local institutions and my neighborhood. And those two things are getting really far apart. And I wonder how much further apart they go before things really start kind of breaking apart, and those threads that are being stretched actually start to break. I don't know. We've gone maybe further than I thought. So maybe there's more room left.
I don't know, but I mean the whole narrative thing. Like, this is why I'm like worried about the schools. Okay, I'm not a parent. I have a niece and a nephew, but I want an educated population so that when I'm retired and the people who are looking after like our government pensions, they know what they're doing. My doctors are going to treat me whether or not we're the same skin color. Like it's like, that's what I'm worried about. And like, like I said, I've been following what's been going on in the schools, but some of the stuff you're putting out about what's happening in the schools is pretty horrific. I mean, there's that one in Las Vegas. Then you put out some stuff yesterday about that school in Buffalo, and I'm just looking at it, like, again, what are these people thinking? Like, like,
I know. So yeah, I mean, in Buffalo, for those of you listening that didn't see the story, it's they've established a whole kind of department of anti-racism. Essentially, they have a diversity czar who's overhauled the curriculum. She's having schools mandating schools celebrate the 13 principles of Black Lives Matter, including kind of transgenderism and disrupting the Western nuclear family dynamics and committing to a kind of vision of collectivism rather than individualism, and then take students through a series of kind of like snipped articles that are shoehorned into curriculum, to the curriculum and into individual lesson plans that are a program of very kind of left-wing political activism. They were saying that, quote, all white people contribute to the perpetuation of systemic racism, that white people are, quote, unfairly rich because they derive their wealth from slavery and discrimination. And all of these really divisive concepts that are being taught to kids as young as kindergarten. And the real irony of that story is that, meanwhile, less than 20% of students in that school district in Buffalo, New York, can read and write at proficiency. So they're failing to do the very basics of education, actually giving the students the tools to critically engage with ideas on their own. And then they're just force feeding them what they should think, how they should feel, who's to blame. And this stuff is really dangerous, I think. And I think some parents are apathetic. They don't know what's happening. That's, I think, a reason why my reporting has taken off the way that it has, is because no one else is really thinking about it or really digging into it in a systematic way. But I think it's also people just kind of accept, well, okay, yeah, the schools, public institutions, that's fine. Don't rock the boat, don't speak out. And it's not going to end well. I think that it's like we need to raise the alarm now, not for, I don't care about a diversity training in some federal agency, whatever, who cares? But if you take the worst elements that are now being filtered through schools, it would have long-term negative consequences.
okay, yeah. I mean, like, I look back to the gangs in the 80s, and then then you had a rise in skinhead groups, kind of as a counter to the gangs, but it was also just territory to sell dope, right? Uh, and when you listen to like the police or the FBI or any kind of like counseling or anything like that, it was these people go after the loners and the kids that feel disenfranchised, the kids that feel set upon, the kids that feel aggrieved. I'm like, that's what you're doing. You're setting up a smorgasbord for Antifa, Proud Boys, Boogaloo, whatever you want. I mean, why were white American kids joining ISIS?
Yeah.
You got to look at some of this stuff, and it just, again, I look, okay, I take a kind of a long view on this, and I look at some of the stuff that Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff did, and then if you, I don't know if you've ever followed Let Grow, like Free Range Kids. And
a little bit, yeah.
Yeah. And so if you look at the safetyism that came around kids with like the stranger danger and all that. And so in the mid to late 80s, that's when the helicopter parenting really started being pushed. And then now you got to the point where it was, where it's now where, mother leaves her kids alone for a few hours so she can go to work and she gets arrested, or kids get taken to child protective services. Like that one, it was a woman, she went to work in a pizzeria. She left her kids at a motel across the street or something like that. And she got arrested for it. I mean,
wow.
So parents, they're taking their kids everywhere. They don't really have, I don't think they have the time to go through the curriculum. And if you look at, if you like, single parenthood's gone up. So if you're a single parent, you have even less time. So it's just like, okay, they're teaching the kids anti-racism. It's a good thing, right? Like that's as far as they're going. I don't think there was like a big master plan that someone laid out. I just think that all these things joined up at one point, and then you have this stuff going through the schools. Like again, I'm looking at these curriculum, and the ethnic maths curriculum that they had in Seattle 2 years ago. Now that's spreading. The things like, if a kid comes in late, if they're not white, don't penalize them, like things like that. Like, I don't know what they're saying there. Like, are they saying that, because I'm brown, I'm lazy, so I shouldn't be expected to do my work on time? Like, I have no idea.
They're saying two things, and I'll try to characterize it, as accurately as possible. They're saying, first of all, that discrimination or disparities in school discipline are evidence of discrimination, and so they're mandating that schools have kind of disciplinary proceedings among students of different racial groups in proportion to how those racial groups are represented in the school population at large. So if Asian kids represent, or let's say Latino kids represent 10% of the school, they should only represent 10% of the disciplinary proceedings. So then teachers, given that mandate, which works from works from the future into the past, they say, okay, well, if I have to meet that quota, meet that mandate, I can't. If for in that classroom, just for argument's sake, there are more students of one certain group that are coming to class late, like your example. Well, you're going to have to filter your disciplinary enforcement to match those categories. It's just like a quota system. The second thing, though, and the deeper issue that I think is totally strange, is that they say that punctuality is a white value, and that punctuality, politeness, objectivity, rationality, quantitative thinking, all of these things are oppressive white values. And that, your question is then the next question, it really deserves to be asked, is saying, well, wait a minute, punctuality? Like, are you saying that it is not part of cultures of India or China or Africa or South America to show up on time? I mean, people show up to work on time. This seems really condescending. And so I think that a lot of these categories that they create that are used as kind of methods of attacking what they see as the white dominant culture actually end up being extremely condescending to anyone who thinks those are actually just good values. And, like rationality. I mean, I think like rationality is good. And I think that everyone has the ability to access rationality. And I think, I'd be curious about your experience in a personal way. Like,
okay, like that to me, that's so insulting. Like, like I said, I read a lot of this stuff. I had the luxury of time because I was on a medical leave. So I spent about 18 months reading almost nothing but critical race theory and intersectionality. So I went through a lot of that.
oh boy.
Yeah. I read this book called Acting White, and the two people who wrote it are making like critical pedagogy. So they're involved in the curriculum for schools. The prologue of the book was how Obama talked and acted white.
Oh God.
And how that's and the rest of the book was why you shouldn't act white if you're not white. And the things like, again, like, rationality. Okay, like I've done a couple of threads on this on Twitter because it just really pissed me off the first time I saw it. I'm like, there's a quote from Plato talking about Egyptians in mathematics. And he was saying, like little children in Egypt are like men, and then like we in Greece are like pigs. We hold Greece up as this, and I'm nothing to take away from like the classics. Like I think that, but we hold Greece up as a standard of like thought and all that. And here's Plato saying the same thing about Egypt. And, these people Egyptians weren't white. It's the same. Okay, for our math, we use Arabic numerals that came from India. The concept of zero came from India. I mean, like the whole thing is so ahistorical, and it's so insulting. I mean,
and the other part about math and is like and computer programming, for example. I've spent a lot of time. My wife works in technology. She's worked at Microsoft and Amazon and other companies. So sometimes I'll go to the office with her, and oftentimes you'll go into a big kind of. I remember going to Microsoft one time, and this is actually a funny story. I went into the office at Microsoft. There's a massive floor in this big sky kind of multi-story building, and it is like almost entirely East Asians and Indians, like South Indians, South Asian Indians, and like almost everybody. And it's like they're performing at kind of that mathematics and rationality and logic at a very high professional level. I think they would be very insulted if I came and said, you guys and your rationality and your math, it's just kind of whiteness and all this stuff. But I remember something funny happened. One of the women who was working in the office came up to me and said, "Oh man, you look just like Mike." I was like, "Oh, okay." I'm like, all right, okay. And she's like, yeah, come here. So we go to the other side of the room. And she starts calling out across the way, Mike, Mike, Mike. And the one white guy that works on the floor, he pops his head up out of the cubicle. This guy looks nothing like me. And then they're like, you guys look the same. And then the guy Mike looks at me. He just shakes his head and sits back down. And it was just one of those funny moments where being in Seattle, being in the United States, and then these funny cultural moments. And I don't know, could someone take offense at that? Could Mike take offense? Could I take offense? Could the programmers take offense? Could the Asians take offense? Maybe. But the other way of looking at it is looking at it that like people of different cultures have different kind of expectations that they bring. And actually it's a really cool when they come together in an unexpected way, in a funny way. And for me, that was like a kind of a beautiful moment. It was a really fun example of what I think is like a healthy way of engaging with people, which is give people the benefit of the doubt. Don't take offense and assume that people are trying to connect with you, not as a racial category, but actually as a human being. And if there's some kind of epiphenomenal or peripheral kind of awkwardness because of this kind of racial conversation, cross-racial conversation, just enjoy it, lean into it, give people grace, give people understanding, give people the benefit of the doubt. And it seems like we've just lost so much of that.
No, but I mean, okay. Again, like there's this acting white and whatever, but growing up, it was predominantly, like I said, WASP, but I had friends who were First Nations. I had friends who were Chinese, other Indians. There were Black kids, Jewish kids. Like we were all a mix. And yeah, when we were playing, we were hanging out. We'd say, one of my closest and oldest friends was German. I'd call him a Nazi, and like, okay, I did, but we're only joking around and stuff, and he'd say stuff to me, and or he'd call me Apu or something, and like, he'd pretend he was Apu from The Simpsons, like, okay, but we didn't mean anything by it. We weren't, it's not like we would go out in public and go up to random strangers and say that.
Have you heard Slavoj Žižek, his take on this stuff? He makes the point, and he makes a point in one of his talks where he says, actually, when you are able to then joke with a person and make those kind of cracks at each other, it's a sign that you actually have a friendship. And I remember that. I mean, even growing up, like, I grew up in Sacramento, California, I guess at one time was listed like the most racially integrated city in the United States. Huge mix of people from all over the world. And I remember guys would make fun of me for being Italian. They'd call me a mafia guy. They'd call me a Goomba or a WAP or all these, kind of old anti-Italian slurs. And, and we'd get into it with each other in those ways. And they wouldn't do it now. Nobody would do it now. People are so scared to even go there. And in a lot of ways, it's good, right? I mean, a lot of that language has been used in a harmful manner in the past and can still be used in a harmful manner today. But we also have lost a bit of ease of conversation because people are so scared that not only, if you call me a Goomba, I mean, I'm not going to be mad, but I could be mad, theoretically. But people are even mad to like say, hey, listen up, guys, because that's, negating people who don't identify on the gender spectrum or whatever. I mean, there's so many little faux pas. It's almost impossible to keep up. And I've learned in my reporting, people are just terrified to say anything. And so our range of thinking, our range of feeling, our actual expression as human beings is really being kind of narrowed by this fear, restricted by this fear. And I don't know if it's actually good. I don't know if we've actually, I don't know if actually society is better because of it. If you look at it in the big picture.
No, I mean, okay, there's like everything you can't, like you said, like, hey guys, or whatever, just the smallest little slip can be a huge faux pas. But again, if I'm hanging out with my buddies and these are people like I've known since high school, or we go on a fishing trip or something, yeah, we're still going to talk to each other the same way. You know, there's not. But if someone new comes along, that's you don't know that person. Like, so you said, like, yeah, it's a thing of friendship. It's a thing of, you know that person. You're used to them. You know what you can say, what you can't say. Like, I mean, your friends. Like, there's certain things you can't say to some of your friends because that's going to really upset them, and you don't. But if there's someone new, then you kind of like, you know, you're kind of testing each other out. But the fear of words. I mean, we're descendant of the people who came out of the trees and, like, explored the next valley, and here we are cowering because some teacher in a video conference said the Chinese word nigga, and oh my god, we might have to fire him now because it sounds like something else. I
Yeah.
mean, they've taken repressive tolerance and they put it, like, made it phonetic now.
Yeah, I know. And there's a lot of those words that are uh kind of kind of orally, like, kind of, they sound the same as other words. And it's like, and then even like the context too, right? It's like, not only is it not the word, but it's used in a context that has nothing to do with the other
Yeah.
phrase. And yeah, I think it's just it really is, it's just disappointing. And I think that it's really disappointing because we have the opportunity right now, with progress in technology, with progress in communications, with progress in so many facets of our kind of technological life, let's say. And yet we seem to be kind of more restricted than ever in what we want to say. So there's this paradox, right? Where, or maybe not a paradox, maybe just a tension or a contradiction, where we have the ability now to speak with anyone at any time, to read any book, to listen to anyone's voice. We have more access and ability to communicate than ever, and yet it feels like we have less to say. And I know that this is not all created equally. I'm Italian, as we talked about, and I still go back to our home village in Italy in the summertime as much as I can, and it's like, even in parts of Europe, it's totally different. They're not gripped by this panic. And the conversations I have in Italy, for example, are very freewheeling. They're very open. They're very provocative. They're very engaging. They're very sometimes heated debate. I have family members that are diehard kind of Marxist Leninist communists. Not Marxist Lenin,
Yeah.
maybe Marxist Leninist. I think that's probably accurate. And then other ones that are more, conservative or kind of European conservatives, and they get after each other, man, and it gets heated. But it feels like no one is trying to play these stupid linguistic games. No one is trying to play the kind of cancel culture tormentor. And people have a vitality to them. The debate has a kind of freedom and openness. And I found that, like, I don't know, I've been engaging on these issues for, in kind of politically and in with the kind of some kind of a platform for now about 2 years. And I've only one debate, and I've offered to debate many times, engaged, solicited, never turned it down. Only had one debate. It was on homelessness in the city of Seattle, and people were so upset about this debate. I was supposed to debate a kind of very liberal, progressive law professor on homelessness policy, that they actually, ran a campaign to call the venue and threaten the venue to shut the whole event down. Like, not even a kind of left-right debate. We eventually found another venue. But even when we got to the debate, the first thing out of my opponent's mouth was, really, this shouldn't be a debate, because I think that if you and I had a beer for a couple hours, you'd really see and you'd really agree with my point of view. And it's like, wait, no, this is a debate. We've been canceled. We're here. Like, no, I don't agree with you. I absolutely do not agree with you. Like, that's the point of this debate. And it's like, I just wonder, I don't know. I see these great clips from like the 60s and 70s in the US, and you'd have like William F. Buckley debating Black Panthers. And it's like, we don't have, I don't know, maybe I'm missing it, but it feels like we have so little of that today. And I think that's a huge loss for the public.
Yeah, but I mean, like, that's the whole safetyism thing, right? We have to keep everyone protected from harm. You change the definition of harm, and it's like, okay, I think that's okay. Like I said, my only dog in any, the only dog I have in any fight is free speech. But like when you go back a little further and like take Enlightenment values, you know, that because of that, we're the only people. So liberal Western democracies, like anything based off the Enlightenment, we're the only people who will sit back and look at our mistakes and we'll call them out. I don't know if we went too far with that. Like, and I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm still saying, there's if something comes to light, bring it to light. Let's don't hide it. But I don't think we should wallow in it. I mean, like the stuff they're doing now, like again with the math curriculums, where I think in Oregon, asking for people to show their work is white supremacy. Leicester University getting rid of medieval English and getting rid of Chaucer. It was a few years ago. I think Cambridge was talking about getting rid of Shakespeare, and then like in the States, getting rid of Mark Twain, getting rid of Kill a Mockingbird, get rid of Millville. Like, you're destroying your own history. It's sad. Like, okay, I worked with the military in Afghanistan, and I saw where the Bamiyan Buddhas stood or used to stand, and the Taliban blew them down. And then like you look at what ISIS did with Palmyra. I mean, they destroyed local history. And I mean, especially like things like Palmyra and Bamiyan Buddhas, those things belong to the world. But, a university in England not teaching Shakespeare or getting rid of Chaucer is like, to me, there's an equivalency there. You're getting rid of history. You're getting rid of your own history. That saddens me a lot.
It saddens me too, and I think that it's based on this kind of false idea that that if something happened in history, it's not merely enough to kind of separate the bad from the good, criticize where you can improve and move forward. It actually has to be destroyed, because the existence of the kind of even the historical record or the historical imagination of that in the culture is itself an impediment to progress, is itself a kind of obstacle to the revolution. And this is, like the Cultural Revolution in China, that when Chairman Mao and then his kind of apparatchiks launched the campaign, they talked about destroying the four olds. So basically, any of the old habits, ideas, customs, and works that were holding back the kind of utopian communist project. And it wasn't enough merely to criticize them or to transcend them or to move beyond them. You actually had to go back into the past and obliterate them, erase them from the collective memory. And it's like when you open up that door, it ends in many cases, certainly in the Cultural Revolution, in just bloodshed, because you're seeking to do something that is like fundamentalist in nature, and also it also kind of, you're cutting off your own roots. And obviously, like, look, the United States and Canada and any country, any nation at any time has ugly stuff in its past, right? This is a universal. But I think that a kind of mature historical cognition or historical perspective is to take those things, to be honestly assess them, and then to kind of also take stock of the progress that's been made. And I'm confident that that we have made progress over time in this country, and I think that the folks who want to kind of destroy all the symbols and histories, it's not simply that they say, hey, these things are actually specifically bad. They want to kind of wipe it all away in order to usher in a totally new world. And the past is something that they find an obstacle.
Yeah. I mean, again, like I was speaking to someone about this last weekend. So there was a paper that was written in 2001 called The Virtuous Cut. And this came out of, I can't remember which university, but it was a big university. I think it was an Ivy League school. Anyways, the paper was about how female genital mutilation was virtuous, and to try to stop it was another form of colonialism. Then you go back to 2019, at the end of the year, like the protests in Hong Kong, they were holding up the Union Jacks and the American flag.
Yeah.
And they were, quote unquote, serious people who said, well, democracy is just another form of colonization, so it would be better if the CCP took over. Then last year, the New York Times ran that same article. It's like, I see a lot of parallels between the way Islam was dealt with and then the way they're talking about with race now. Like, it's so when Ayaan Hirsi Ali started speaking up, the only people who would really talk to her were Fox News. It's like, oh, she's right wing now. It's like, well, assholes, you wouldn't speak to her. And it's the same thing over and over and over again. So now, oh, John McWhorter is right wing. It's like, in what world is John McWhorter right wing? Or, I mean, Camille Foster, after he went on Bill Maher recently, like some guy called him a house Negro. It's just like the most disgusting insults. And I see so many parallels between what ex-Muslims got or reform Muslims at the start of the 2000s and to what's going on now to any black person who's speaking out against this stuff.
Yeah, I think, I don't know the history of the kind of ex-Muslims in North America. I've seen some of their materials and writing, but I think the principle is always the same, right? The kind of dissenter from within your own ranks is seen as a kind of greater transgression than just a simple one of your opponents. I think even Barry Weiss, who's like, who is kind of surprised sometimes by the level of vitriol and kind of just deranged lunacy that gets thrown her way. She's a very kind of calm, reasonable person. She's, I think, definitely center left. That's how I would describe her. And yet, because she had been at the New York Times and had dissented, people feel like this sense of kind of betrayal, which leads to a sense of rage, right? It's like any kind of apostate in a religious context. It's the same thing with our political tribes. And then I think especially the ugliest expression of that is in our kind of racial categories, where, dating back to Clarence Thomas, certainly, and even before that, where, if you're a black intellectual that's in the center or the center right and criticizing, or center left and criticizing the far left, you're going to take the heat from people. And I think that it's how I see it is like, man, you are putting yourself at kind of at some risk, right? And it takes real courage, like a John McWhorter or a Glenn Loury or Camille, and those guys who have been really speaking up lately about the kind of dangers of the very far left. I mean, those guys have a lot of courage. I'm personally inspired by many of them because they're willing to basically stake out their position and take that kind of blowback in response.
Yeah, and I mean, there's them. There's also, but one of the people though, because I know you wrote about her, and I don't want to get this wrong, but I think you're involved a bit with this. Was that lady out of Las Vegas who's suing her school? Someone like her. I mean, she's okay. John McWhorter's, he's written books. He's been on CNN. He's got some fame, so he's got a little bit more gravitas. But she's just, a mom who's like pissed off about what's going on with her kids. Like someone like that, it's like she's got a lot of courage.
Yeah, she does. Yeah, and I think that's what it's going to take. It's going to take everyday people, and yeah, and maybe I think you're making also a good point, is that we shouldn't just focus on the people who are in the intellectual sphere, but actually people who are kind of like humble heroes. I think where they're not trying to fight these kind of intellectual battles at a national stage, but they're actually saying, hey, look, this is important to me because this is my kid's school, or this is the church that I attend, or this is my local government, that I rely on to provide services. And I think that in a lot of ways, those are the folks that are honestly even putting themselves more in the crosshairs, more at risk, because people can lose jobs. They can lose, they can get kind of trashed in the media with no platform to defend themselves. And there are a lot of stories like that. And people, I always find it strange when people argue like cancel culture isn't real. And it's like, well, I mean, how many stories do we need before it's like, I mean, to convince you? Because it's like, these are people that are kind of normal, everyday people, private citizens, that are taking tremendous risk to stand up. And I've reported on a number of them, but I'll tell you, in my reporting, I would say more than 95% of my sources within American institutions that are giving me documents asked to remain anonymous because they're too scared to speak out.
Yeah, I mean, okay, that's a, if you're sitting there, if you're working, you're providing for your family. I can see that. I can, because just the way the prevailing winds are going. But like on that topic, like I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I just saw, I think you'd put that out. There was what, New Hampshire and now West Virginia are coming up with, I guess either bills or something, or I don't know if they're executive orders, but kind of like what Trump did. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. It's similar to what Trump did. And last year, the administration said, "Hey, you can't hold these. You can hold diversity training sessions. You can do that, but what you can't do is discriminate, or you can't denigrate, stereotype, or demean people on the basis of race and sex, race or sex rather." And state legislatures are now trying to take some of that concept, basically codifying into state law, saying, diversity training programs or school curricula cannot demean people because of their race, cannot assign collective guilt to people because of their race, and then cannot traffic in very divisive racial stereotypes against any group. So the kind of beauty of this is that it would prevent both the Klan from designing a school curriculum saying that all Black people are bad. It would also prevent the critical race theorists from designing a curriculum that says all white people are bad. So we could use a simple, single standard for everyone that takes out the kind of racist and neo-racist fringes on both sides of the political spectrum.
Well, great. Look, I know you got to go, so I don't want to keep you much longer. Thank you very much for coming on. It's been great. And thanks everyone for listening.
Yeah, thank you. Good to talk to you.